I knew better than to expect warmth. The message had been brief: family celebration this Saturday, come early, the kind of invitation that assumes compliance without offering context. Still, I ironed a shirt. Still, I drove across town. Habit has a longer memory than hope. The house looked the same from the curb. New paint on the doorframe, balloons tied low enough to brush the hedges. Through the window I could see the table already set, chairs pulled in close, place cards standing upright like small declarations. Names I recognized. Mine wasn't there. I stood for a moment, keyless, watching the shapes of people move inside. Laughter rose and fell. It didn't sound different because I was outside. It never does. When I stepped in, my mother startled in the way people do when they've miscalculated timing, not emotion. My father glanced at the table, then back at me, as if comparing two lists. My sister looked directly at the empty space between chairs and smiled, not cruelly, exactly, just with certainty. She said, light as a shrug, "Only immediate family gets a spot." It was the kind of sentence that begs for clarification while pretending it doesn't. No one corrected her. My mother busied herself with a serving spoon. My father adjusted a napkin. Silence took its seat where mine might have been. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because nodding required less explanation than staying. I said I'd forgotten something in the car. I didn't look back to see if anyone followed me to the door. Outside, the afternoon felt ordinary enough to be insulting. A neighbor waved. A balloon escaped its knot and bobbed against the siding. I walked to my car and sat there longer than necessary, hands on the wheel, not angry so much as finished with a familiar equation: show up, be reduced, absorb it quietly, repeat. On the drive home, I didn't replay the scene. I thought about the email I'd sent weeks earlier, the one that had felt overly formal at the time. As discussed, I'll proceed with the paperwork. I remembered hovering over the send button, wondering if I was being dramatic. I sent it anyway. That night, I slept well. The knock came the next morning, earlier than courtesy allows. When I opened the door, my parents stood side by side, coats on, expressions aligned in a way I hadn't seen in years. Urgency has a way of unifying people. "We need to talk," my mother said, already stepping forward as if the doorway were negotiable. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't ask them in. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't expect the timing," he said, choosing words as if they might be weighed later. "They told me about the call they'd received at dawn, about the letter emailed shortly after, about the deadline." The language had been unmistakable: no extensions, no informal workarounds. An administrator's name, a case number, a requirement for a signature, mine. Years ago, when my parents' health had begun its uneven decline, they'd asked me to handle the practical things. Forms, follow-ups, conversations that required patience more than affection. I'd agreed, partly out of responsibility, partly because it was easier to be useful than wanted. Over time, the role had formalized. Power of attorney isn't dramatic. It's just thorough. I'd kept it current, quietly. Without announcement. My mother's voice softened. "We assumed you'd understand. Yesterday was for family." I looked at her, really looked, and felt something settle into place. "I did understand," I said. "That's why I left." My father's shoulders sagged. "We need your help." There it was. Not an apology. A request. I stepped aside and let them in, but only as far as the entryway. We stood among shoes and coats, the ordinary clutter of a life they visited but didn't inhabit. "I can help," I said evenly. "The process requires my involvement, but it also requires clarity." My sister wasn't mentioned, but her absence hovered. The celebration from the day before felt distant, irrelevant, like a set dismantled overnight. "What kind of clarity?" my mother asked. "That I won't be treated as optional," I said. "Not at tables. Not in decisions. If I'm immediate enough to manage consequences, I'm immediate enough to be acknowledged." My father nodded, too quickly. Agreement is easy when urgency sharpens it. I didn't press further. I didn't recount old slights or list examples. Authority doesn't need embellishment. I told them what I would do and what I wouldn't. The administrator would hear from me by noon. The signature would be provided once conditions were documented. Everything would be professional, transparent, reversible if they chose differently later. My mother reached for my arm and stopped herself. When they left, the hallway felt larger. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against it for a moment, not from relief, not from grief, but from the simple exertion of holding a line. Later, as promised, I made the calls. I signed where required. The system moved forward, indifferent to family narratives. That indifference felt like a strange ally. In the weeks that followed, nothing transformed. There were no sudden dinners with extra chairs, no confessions. My sister sent a text that said, "Hope everything's okay," which I answered with, "Yes, it is." My parents became more careful with invitations, more explicit with language. Sometimes they included me. Sometimes they didn't. The difference was that now, either choice had weight. On a quiet evening, I set the table in my own apartment. 2-place settings, because a friend was coming by. I placed the chairs with room to breathe between them. It wasn't symbolic, it was practical. When the knock came, it was gentle. I opened the door without bracing.